A few weeks ago, I had just finished preaching in Atlanta, and I was on my way back to Toronto. Walking through the airport, I went past a bookstore, and I saw a book. I just kind of focused in on it, called Heaven is for Real. I looked at it, and I looked at it again, picked it up. I thought, my, this is an interesting looking book. And I bought it. And as I flew back to Toronto, I read the whole thing. And I thought, boy, this would be a great feature on 100 Huntley Street, not knowing the guesting department had already booked. The author, Todd Burpo, with Lynn Vincent, on Heaven is for Real, a little boy's astounding story of his trip to heaven and back. Welcome, Todd.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I know you're doing a lot of appearances, a lot of interviews. I appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to be with us, and you'll be featured all this month. Let's start from the beginning. This is basically a setup for the rest of the month.
Okay.
Tell me the story. You've got a 4-year-old son. His appendix have burst. You don't know this. You don't know why he's so sick. And I'm just, I'm jumping in the middle of the story to kind of save time here. You rush him to a hospital. This is in Nebraska.
Yeah.
What happens?
Well, this happened a little over 8 years, and so this is not new information for us or our friends, but those memories, they're embedded in our minds. We lived probably every parent's worst nightmare because we saw our son slipping away. And as a pastor, I've been beside many one's bedsides. They've asked me in the room for comfort. And you see how the body shuts down, and I was seeing that. He was 3 years old and 10 months, and my son, dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't getting better. He wasn't responding to the medication. I could see my wife's tears. I could see the pain, and people are looking at you. Do you trust the doctor? Do you do something different? Finally, we took him out of our little hospital, went to the closest regional medical center that had surgeons, and that's where they determined that his appendix had already ruptured.
And by the way, the first doctor that you consulted with didn't pick it up.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, too. There was a bug going around town, and when Colton started throwing up, so did his sister. So it looked like we had the bug. The problem was Cassie got better and Colton didn't.
Yeah.
And so there was lots of things that complicate the situation. Yeah. But people say, why did you let your son be sick for so long? Well, no parent lets your son be sick. But let me tell you, we were asking all the same questions. We were beating ourselves up. When we were sitting there in North Platte and they said, we have to operate on your son, I remember sitting there in the hallway. They pulled us outside of the testing area, and we knew when they secluded us off. It was bad. Yeah. And I remember standing up above my wife, and here's my boy just laying limp in her lap, and he's not even moving. And I remember seeing that, and I'm just begging, God, give me one more chance, please. And I wish I could forget, Yeah. But we can't. And they said, we have to operate on your son. They took him to surgery, and we were calling, we were begging, we were asking people, we need you to pray now. Our prayer chain, it was so nice to have that. We were calling not only our church, but our friends, their churches, asking them to pray because we knew how serious the situation was at that moment. We needed prayer right then. And we would find out months later that it was during that so critical surgery that our son left and went to heaven.
Yeah. Now, I remember how you described this in the book, but for our viewers who haven't read the book yet and need their own copy, you need to tell us how that happened. He's in surgery. Your wife is in one part of the hospital in the waiting room. You go into a smaller room to kind of wrestle with God for your son's life. I mean, you were ticked, right?
Oh yeah, I think sometimes people think pastors are different. Yeah. This one isn't. I don't know about others, but I'm a dad first. Yeah. And I think as a dad, I've always felt my job is to provide and to protect my family. I'd had a terrible year, broken leg, couldn't work, like I normally had. The income stream was way reduced. And then when my son was being hauled away from surgery, he's screaming for me, Daddy, don't let him take me. Daddy, make him stop. And I've never felt him smaller as a man. I was totally demasculated at that moment. And but as a pastor, we don't have the freedom to blow it. Laymen can do it and they're forgiven. Pastors aren't. Yeah. And so I didn't want to appear weak for my wife. I wanted to be strong for her. I didn't want my son to see the fear that was inside me, and I sure didn't want the hospital staff to see me just blow it. And so when I had my first chance to slip away and kind of separate from everybody else, a nurse had come to us and told us to go to the waiting room, and we'd left some stuff in the pre-op room, so I volunteered to go get it. I remember going back in that room, shutting the door, pulling the curtains in there, and just for about 10, maybe 15 minutes, I was just, God, where are you? What are you doing? I need you now. And I was upset. I was questioning, is it worth it to be a pastor? I'd gone through a terrible year, and I'm like, God, I've tried to keep the faith, try to, trust you, and now you're going to take my son. I was really, at my lowest of the low.
It's kind of like a perfect storm, wasn't it? Because you'd broken your leg, and you supported your ministry mainly through your garage door business.
Yeah.
And so you're at a pretty much all-time low as it was, and this is just kind of the final straw.
It was.
So you expected him probably to die.
Well, we knew at that moment that if God didn't do something, we were going to lose our
So
son.
while you're praying and your wife is waiting anxiously, you're wrestling with God. By the way, the word Israel means God wrestler, just in case you didn't know that. What was going on in the operating room?
Well, later on, Colton will describe to us that he left his body there at that time.
Now, did he physically die? Did the doctor say that
No.
his heartbeat stopped?
Dr. O'Halloran, I've talked to him many times. He explained to me that when a kid's in surgery, they're not like adults. He says in an adult, they can see that they're losing a patient, their vitals will gradually drop. But he says with a kid as young as Colton was, he said their vitals are strong and then they're gone. He said there's no warning when we lose a kid. We can't tell how close, but they were giving us no comfort, no hope. Even when the doctors put Colton out of the hospital room, he'd been infected and septic for so long. They weren't giving us any promising of him recovering. And so even though he never officially coded, the part that makes it undeniable is when he said, Dad, I was above you and I could see you. And he talks to me about that room.
Now, he's 4 years old.
Yeah.
How was his English at that point in time? Was he pretty articulate as a kid?
He was. I think some parents never, like in our house, we never used baby words or baby language around our kids. We wanted them to learn how to talk. And so we just didn't use kids. Now, he still had some of his own vernacular. But at the same time, his language and his English was his.
So how long after, he did recover.
Mm-hmm.
How long after the recovery did he tell you that stuff that only he could have seen if he had been above you?
Well, he tried to tell me in the hospital when he woke up, but he scared me to death. When he woke up from that first surgery, when I went to him, he told me, Dad, I almost died. I was not prepared to talk to my 3-year-old about dying.
Oh, he's 3.
3 years old and 10 months.
3 and 10 months, almost 4.
Yeah, almost 4. And I was like, I changed the subject. Now, if he had said, Dad, I saw Jesus, I just came back from heaven, I would have probably talked to him then, but he didn't start there. He started with something that I was still scared. I didn't know if my son was going to live. And I was wrong, but I felt like if I talked to him about dying, he'd quit on me, that I'd give him okay to stop fighting. So I changed the subject. But he kept saying things that we didn't pick up on. Jesus told me I had to be nice, things like that. But when he finally said that the angels sang to him in the hospital, and he made that comment 4 months later, that's when Mom and I stopped and said, okay, we've missed something.
4 months later.
Yeah.
He described where you were, what you were doing, and didn't he talk about the impact of your fight with God?
Yeah, I was in his room because he talked to me. He made mention that Jesus came back to get him and tell him he was sending him back, and somehow the Holy Spirit prompted me to ask this question. I'm working through all these things, trying to deal with them. But this happened for us bit by bit. When you read the book, you get it all at once. We had it bit by bit. And maybe I finally had the courage to say, well, Colton, when you told me when Jesus came to get you, did you want to come back? And he looked up at me, and he was I remember him in his room. He's looking down, he's playing, he drops his toys. He says, no, Dad, I wanted to stay. And then all of a sudden, that was the question I was seeking out answers for him for. But then he carried on the conversation. He says, remember when I was yelling for you when I woke up in the hospital? Now, when he went away for that first surgery, when we were praying desperately, asking people to pray, a nurse came out to to that waiting room afterwards, and she asked, "Is Colton's daddy out here?" Oh man, that was a moment where
You
you're just
figured,
kind of like,
you figured he's gone.
well, I don't know. I didn't know what to figure.
Yeah.
And she's like, well, he's screaming for you and we can't calm him down. And all of a sudden, it's amazing how those screams that cut to the middle of my soul when he left was like, he made it, you know.
Mm.
He said, well, Dad, remember when I was screaming for you when I woke up? And I'm like, son, I'll never forget. He says, well, Dad, the reason why I was screaming for you is was Jesus told me he was answering your prayer. That's why he was sending me back.
Really?
Yeah. Talk about conviction.
You know, I've often said to people as a pastor myself that the Lord finds desperate prayers irresistible.
Yeah. I was desperate.
I don't know if I can build a theology on that or a doctrine on that, but it seems to me that when you really are desperate, you're really honest, you're really authentic. How can God resist?
Well, I think honesty is huge.
Yeah.
For me, that prayer, whether it was reverent, it wasn't. Whether it was biblical or scriptural, I wasn't praying any scripture verses. I was just being completely honest with how I was feeling and what I was going through. And I think a lot of people miss the fact that you can be honest with God and He can handle it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we think that because someone didn't hear that word I thought, God didn't, but He heard it. You know, and I think a lot of times, even our relationships, at least even mine with my spouse, there's things we hold back because we're afraid that if someone finds that out about us, they won't respect us as much. But God already knows all that stuff and He loves you anyway. It's kind of like Thomas. Thomas gets a bad reputation for being doubting Thomas. I call him honest Thomas. Mm-hmm. He just verbalized what everyone else in the room had already thought. Mm-hmm. And what does Jesus say to Thomas? Thomas, is this what you need? Come here. He didn't scold him, doesn't yell at him. He says, you need to touch me? My peace be with you. Here, touch. See. And I think if we would just get honest with God, we would find that maybe the peace that we need, that He'd be able to give it to us.
When you're telling that Thomas story, I think about Colton's story.
Yeah.
When as a almost 4-year-old, he tells you a few months later, I guess he was 4 by now, that Jesus had markers.
Yeah. I
thought, what? I'm reading this and I go, markers? What do you mean markers? And in his little 4-year-old logic, he tells, well, he had some markers on his hands. And I go, whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa. Now, friends, this is just the beginning of a story. Sorry to keep you hanging here. But this little 4-year-old comes back and tells a story about what he sees, what he experiences. And he tells it to parents who are saying, what? And I really appreciate the fact, you make this point again and again in the book, Todd, that you didn't ask him leading questions.
Yeah.
And in fact, in many ways, you approached him almost skeptically, not in a negative sense, but really? And that really, I think, lends a real air of authenticity to the book. Plus, when you're listening to a 4-year-old describe what he's seeing, I mean, unembellished, without any theological background, you say, whoa. So this is the book, Heaven is for Real. A little boy's astounding story of his trip to heaven and back. And all this month, we're going to be featuring Todd Burpo, talking about little aspects of this. You'll be seeing some video of Todd as a 12-year-old, talking about his memories of that 4-year-old experience. And you're going to have access to the book. And so you can even call now. I mean, if you want this book, and I know you do, here's how you can get it.
Heaven is for Real is the true story of the 4-year-old son of a small-town Nebraska pastor who during emergency surgery slips from consciousness and enters heaven. He survives, and young Colton begins to share how he met his miscarried sister, whom no one had told him about.
And she comes up and gives me a big hug and tells me she's my sister, and then she explains what happened.
Colton continued to describe the horse that only Jesus could ride and how the Holy Spirit sends power from heaven to help us. Heaven is for Real is told by the father, Todd Burpo, but often in Colton's own words. The message is simple: heaven is a real place. Jesus really loves children, and be ready, there is a coming last battle. This book is our thanks to you for your support. To request a copy, write to us in Canada or in the United States. Visit crossroads.ca or simply call 1-800-265-3100.